So thank you for the Centre for inviting me. It's always a pleasure and a great honour. I certainly think that the Centre is really at the the leading edge of knowledge exchange around physical activity, of disseminating research and also advocating for physical activity. And it's certainly a resource that I've gone to time and time again in England and Australia and now in Canada. And thank you for joining us this morning. So I will get started. Yeah, the title is a question. Is sweat the best antidepressant? And the answer is yes. I know that because as the introduction this morning, some of these politicians are very impressive. And this was one that I came across. It's a guy called Zach Wamp, who's a Republican congressman. And he spoke at a conference last year, the Active Living Research Conference in Washington, and part of the conference aims was to meet policymakers around physical activity. And this guy was very inspirational, talking about the war on physical inactivity. And he coined this phrase that sweat is the best antidepressant. And I hadn't actually heard that cliche, which surprised me because I have been working in this area for quite a while. But it's a nice expression, and really what I want to kind of talk about then today is the evidence that perhaps supports Mr. Wamp's kind of conclusions. The other interesting thing that I always remember is that he was a Republican and he was quite happy with George Bush, but he said the one kind of fault that he had with George Bush was that he was the most fittest American president in the history of the U.S. and George Bush never really pushed physical activity onto the national agenda. So I think last year, Mark Tremblay talked a little bit about some of his research looking at Mennonite communities. And what I just wanted to talk about today to start with is just kind of framing the case for physical activity and mental health in the larger kind of debates and issues around physical inactivity and obesity. Because certainly this research of Mark and others suggests that the environment that we live in is changing radically, and one in which perhaps we are less active, not necessarily through choice, but almost kind of automatically because of the environments that we are in. And we have this kind of dual kind of challenge going on, that we live in an environment where there is increased availability of food, that food is easy to access. We have this strong signal to eat. We know when we're hungry. We have a weak satiation. It's sometimes difficult to stop. Eating is socially rewarding. We all like to go to nice restaurants and be seen, and there are no viable alternatives. So we have this kind of evidence for an increase in energy intake. On the opposite side, we also have a decline in perhaps our energy expenditure. We have reduced availability for being active. So we have the electronic gadgets that help with the garage door, or for turning channels on the TV. We don't get, unless you're active, we don't necessarily get this message, this feeling, oh, we should go out and go for a jog. It's aversive. We have a strong signal to stop. Inactivity can be rewarding, and it can be high status. As we move up the ladder, we get a desk job. That's where we all want to go. So this is this notion of that obesogenic environment. So I'm sure that some of the work that Mark Tremblay talked about last year, that we're evolving in a way to an environment that is decreasing opportunities for physical activity, but at the same time increasing opportunities for energy intake. And I just wonder if, given that kind of case, if we have something similar when it comes to mental health, that perhaps the stresses that we faced 70,000 years ago and how we dealt with those stresses are obviously very different from the types of stresses that we face today and how we cope with them. So, and this is a fairly simplistic analogy, I guess, but were the stresses 70,000 years ago, it's more about fight or flight. There was an immediate response. There was a high adrenaline rush. These kind of stresses were acute, but they were at least infrequent, and there was adequate time for recovery. But today we have a completely different situation, a more delayed response. We're continually at work. So anyone who has a BlackBerry knows this kind of case of continually kind of checking it, never putting it down, and always thinking about your work. I know I'm talking more about myself perhaps, but modern stressors, again, could be characterized by a high mental demand. It's chronic, it's frequent, and we never really get time perhaps to recover. So does this then get played out in what we now see today in terms of mental health problems? As kind of mentioned in the introduction, mental health problems are widespread. There are some statistics suggest that 1 in 5 of Canadians will experience a mental health problem in any given year. Some debate about this, but mental health problems may be increasing. Some debate because it may be because we're getting better at identifying mental health problems and treating them, or the stigma around mental health problems is being reduced, so people are more comfortable coming forward about a mental health problem. But again, I think we can generally find some statistics to suggest that the prevalence of certain mental health conditions have increased. And of course, they're expensive to treat, talking about billions of dollars in both direct and indirect costs. So mental health promotion is an important public health priority, but it's also a challenge when we talk about mental health promotion. And certainly there has been intermittent interest in how physical and mental health are related over the centuries, but I think certainly in the last century, the body has tended to be ignored in mental health treatment. But given that kind of opening background I talked about, an obesogenic environment, an environment where perhaps the stresses are very different from what they once were, I think there may be a particularly strong case for considering strategies that really try to reconnect the mind and the body in terms of trying to prevent and treat poor mental health. So, I think things have certainly changed. I think there is much greater recognition of how physical health could influence mental health and how mental health can influence physical health. And I think that's changed for a number of reasons. Certainly in my research, majority of my mental health research is looking at schizophrenia and antipsychotic medication where there's a high prevalence of obesity and diabetes. And what's killing people with schizophrenia prematurely is nothing directly related to schizophrenia. It's about cardiovascular disease. So there has been a real recognition now amongst the mental health community, psychiatric community in particular, that we need to address the physical health needs of people with mental health problems. There's also been, I think, a change, a philosophical change in addressing people more holistically and moving from a focus on illness to a focus on wellness. And I think there's also been a greater advocacy movement. So people with mental health problems have also typically long advocated for care that goes beyond just a focus on treatment. So I think things are certainly changing, and as mentioned, I now edit a journal. It's only into its second volume, Mental Health and Physical Activity. But I think that is certainly some kind of evidence to suggest that this kind of case for physical activity being good for mental health is being widely accepted. And I even have further evidence of that. And this is a true story that Elsevier, the publisher, got an email from the producers of Grey's Anatomy wanting some journals to put on a therapist's desk in a scene. And so Elsevier sent them Mental Health and Physical Activity. And here is the production shot. And I kind of watched the episode, and I did briefly see a blurred blue image. So I think this surely is evidence in the mainstream that physical activity is good for mental health, or at least as my partner suggests, she's now 3 degrees of separation from Dr. McDreamy. So why is potentially physical activity the best, sweat the best antidepressant? Well, I think there are probably a range of theoretical reasons, at least, because no one's actually done this, or investigated this. But certainly physical activity may be a cheaper option if we compare it to therapy, or if we compare it to medication. Depending on what we mean by physical activity and what we mean by exercise, potentially it's a cost-effective option. I think it's fairly benign. I think there are very few side effects, negative side effects associated with physical activity. Certainly if you receive doctor's approval to start an exercise program and you're being supervised in some way. I think it's potentially far-reaching. So we know through broader physical activity campaigns that maybe we can have unintended consequences on outcomes such as mental health. So perhaps we can help people who either do not necessarily want to seek mental health treatment or perhaps cannot access mental health treatment. Perhaps physical activity campaigns, broader physical activity initiatives can have an impact on mental health as well. It's something that can be self-administered. And I think this is something that I unfortunately found out a couple of years ago. My wife and I were faced with a rather difficult circumstances, and we urgently wanted to seek psychiatric treatment, but it took us 12 weeks to see a psychiatrist before we could get into the door of a psychiatrist. And we certainly felt that we needed to see one much quicker than that. But it was, caught my attention, 12 weeks, that's a typical kind of length of an exercise program in the exercise and mental health literature. And so I've certainly done some other digging around about, well, how long does it take people to get mental health treatment? And one kind of report from the Fraser Institute suggests that on average it may take some people 18 weeks from seeing a GP and then being referred to a psychiatrist and then actually receiving treatment. And so this kind of automatically seems to me as a potential opening or a potential point of intervention for a range of adjunctive strategies that perhaps can be provided for people whilst they are seeking or waiting to receive specialist mental health care. So that point of exercise or physical activity being something that people can do for themselves is an added bonus. And I think the final one, which I'm not going to talk too much about because I think we're fairly confident and comfortable with this, is obviously the physical health benefits of this treatment approach. So this is really the win-win scenario. Why sweat is the best antidepressant, because we're not just getting, I'll change that. Irrespective of any mental health benefit, we can be confident that we can derive, or people can derive, physical health benefits from this treatment approach, which they aren't going to get necessarily from medication or through therapy. And so this obviously ties into some of the work that I do. And here's an example of just a study showing the increasing prevalence in obesity over time in people with schizophrenia. And this is really related to the new generation of antipsychotics. But certainly there is a very high prevalence of obesity and diabetes in this population. So physical activity as part of a lifestyle management program is a necessity. We also know that typically people with mental health problems are less active than the general population. And here is just some data from the Canadian Community Health Survey that we're working on at the moment, with an interest in bipolar depression, which has received less attention. But this shows just on the, it's actually not as dramatic as we thought we'd find, but you can see people with a lifetime history of major depressive disorder, certainly if we just look here, have a higher prevalence of inactivity in comparison to those with mood disorders or, without mood disorder or with bipolar disorder. So I think that's certainly a strong case anyway for considering physical activity, that here is a population, people with mental health problems, who are perhaps at greater risk of inactivity-related premature mortality and morbidity. So I think we're justified in promoting physical activity. But now I want to kind of focus a little bit more on mental health and focus on depression, and mainly because depression has received the most research attention in the exercise and mental health literature, probably because it's also the most common mental health problem. But I want to be a little bit kind of bold and suggest that exercise actually causes a reduction in depression. And that's moving things a little bit beyond the typical kind of wishy-washy statements that we tend to make, that there's a relationship or there's a correlation between exercise and mental health. In this case, we're stating that exercise actually causes reductions in depression. And that's an important statement to make, because if we can get at causality, then it helps with things like prescription, that we can start to prescribe exercise as a treatment with a bit more confidence. But I think more importantly, it helps with the legitimization, particularly in the mental health community, that if we're if we're really kind of committed to this case for exercise and wanting to promote exercise for mental health, then a causal kind of argument would be a particular strength. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to kind of rely on an epidemiologist by the name of Hill, who talked about a range of criteria that could be used to start to develop the argument for there being a causal relationship between the environment, in this case I'm going to talk about exercise, and a particular disease, depression. So in terms of temporal sequence is perhaps the most critical of the criteria in terms of epidemiological data. So cross-sectional data is obviously where we have a one-shot kind of examination of the relationship between depression and inactivity or activity. So that slide that I showed you, that's a cross-sectional study that suggested that people with depression are less active than those without depression. But that doesn't suggest anything about, well, does the inactivity cause depression? We can rely on, instead, prospective epidemiological studies which look at large samples of people, follow them over many years, in this case, in this study I'm just about to talk about, over 30 years, and look at whether or not inactivity precedes the risk of depression at a later date. So this is a study by Camacho and colleagues from California, and first started in 1965, where they tracked around 5,000 to 6,000 people, gave them a range of measures assessing lots of physical and mental health outcomes. But just for the purposes of this, focusing on the relationship between activity and depression, what they found at baseline in 1965, those individuals who were low active or reported low levels of activity were almost twice as likely 10 years later to report clinical depression. So this is evidence to suggest that inactivity precedes the onset of depression. And this has been found in quite a few studies now. And this is just a study that we've just recently published. It's cheating a little bit because it's not actually looking at depression. It's looking at psychological distress, which is a kind of an amalgamation of anxiety and depression. And this is looking at older adults, adults over 65 years of age, tracking them over 6 years, and again, looking at the relationship between physical activity and this mental health outcome in a large sample, representative sample. And there are 3 lines here. The green line is people who didn't change their activity levels. So for those who stayed active or their activity levels remained stable, there was no change in their psychological distress. But those people who became less active, in the blue line, their psychological distress increased, while those people who actually became more active, their psychological distress significantly declined as well. So this is just another example of one of these longitudinal studies that show a nice kind of relationship between people becoming more active and psychological distress or depression decreasing, and vice versa, inactivity perhaps preceding or becoming less active, preceding negative changes in mental health. And I think the other important finding from this study is that even late life changes in physical activity appear to alleviate distress as well. So there's, again, at least 8 large epidemiological studies like the Camacho study focusing on depression that have found this temporal sequencing of inactivity preceding depression. Certainly there are methodological kind of critiques of these types of papers, that perhaps there are other things going on. Maybe there's bias between the people who perhaps drop out of these studies, or maybe there are some confounding variables. Maybe it's about socioeconomic status, maybe it's about education, maybe it's about disability that explains some of these relationships. But statistically, these can be controlled for, and the findings still hold true. So we have temporal sequencing. We've also got, I believe, strength of association. So the epidemiological evidence, does suggest this. Again, when you look at the range of these 8 studies, nearly a 2-fold risk of developing depression if you have a low activity status at some point in time. We can also draw on meta-analyses from experimental studies. And meta-analyses are a statistical technique for combining studies and transforming differences between kind of experimental and control conditions into a common metric. So it kind of aggregates a large number of studies and comes up with this metric known as the effect size. And the effect size can be small, typically considered small, moderate, or large. So the stronger the association, it's large. If it's a small effect, then it's a small relationship. And effect size is typically from 0 to 0.4 is considered small. From about 0.5 to 0.7, it's a moderate relationship, and anything higher than 0.7 is large. Now, you won't necessarily be able to make out this. I just like this figure because it's from a Cochrane review, and a Cochrane review is a meta-analysis, and this is quite a famous type of table because it lists the studies on the left-hand side, and it looks at, these are in this case, the mean scores on the Beck Depression Inventory at the end of the intervention for the experimental group, for the control group. Here is the effect sizes for each of individual study, but the most important number is this one that you may not be able to see this at the bottom of minus 0.82. Now that's a large effect. That suggests that there's a large difference favoring the exercise group in exercise and depression studies. The other thing from this is that there are 28 randomized controlled trials. I've often kind of come across, talking to some mental health professionals, and they would say to me about exercise depression, well, there's no evidence. There are very few randomized controlled trials. Well, 28 is quite a number. So, strength of association, large effect. The guys that did this, Mead, sorry, I should have referenced Mead, Morley, Campbell, Gregg, McMurdo, and Lawler. They're not real fans of exercise for some reason. I think that they can't believe this. They cannot believe that there may be a large effect. So there are different ways, and this is the strength of a meta-analysis, that you can look at other variables that may influence the size of this effect. So one way that you may want to look at this, well, let's look at just the strongest studies. Because some of these studies, there are limitations, there are weaknesses. But when they looked at the 7 best studies, and one of the kind of criteria for them as labeling this as a best study was that there was blinded outcome, that the people either assessing people whether or not they had depression at the end, they didn't know which group that you were assigned to. So it's just that other layer of methodological rigor that kind of helps in conducting randomized controlled trials. So when they just looked at randomized controlled trials with this blinded outcome, the effect size halved. So it now became a small effect of minus 0.39. So it now became was a large effect, now a small effect. Now there's still strength of association for me. A small effect, again, it's one of those issues of the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. Well, of course, anyone who's had a mental health problem would recognize that maybe small changes are actually very, very powerful. And also, if physical activity has all these other benefits, it's good for physical health, it could be potentially cheap, it's far-reaching, then again, maybe a small effect is justified. But I was interested in, of course, when Mead and colleagues in their meta-analysis really kind of hammered exercise then on this kind of criteria and this movement from a large to a small effect, I just wanted to check, well, what kind of effects did people find in other meta-analyses looking at looking at depression, in particular looking at medication and depression. And here is probably quite an infamous meta-analysis that you may have came across last year, because it also looks not just at published research studies, but also looked at studies conducted by pharmaceutical companies that were never actually submitted for publication, which suggests that there's probably a reason why. And so this, again, you don't worry about the details here about what this table is showing, but lots of studies, and these are very strong studies as well, looking at antidepressants and depression. And what do they find to be their effect size? A small effect. This is, meta-analyses are criticized for comparing apples and oranges, and I'm kind of taking it a double step forward in terms of comparing these two meta-analyses. But I thought this is quite illustrative of the point here that even with what commonly is considered the standard kind of treatment for depression, the use of antidepressants, we still find a small effect in comparing the depression or the treatment to a placebo. I'll get off that hobby horse. But at least, lots of experimental evidence, which is one of the criteria for a causal case for exercise. And I just wanted to show one example, because it's probably one of the strongest strongest studies that have been reported by Blumenthal and colleagues at Duke University. And it's also a good one because it was the first one that actually compared exercise with medication, with antidepressant medication. Relatively large study for this field, 156 people, comparing aerobic exercise, 16 weeks of aerobic exercise to antidepressant medication or combination. And what they found at the end was that there was no difference between the exercise and the antidepressant medication. And I think this is a couple of important points here, is that I wouldn't argue that exercise is better than other treatments for its antidepressant effect. I think exercise is probably as good as things like antidepressant medication and potentially some therapy, but you have all of these other benefits that can be accrued through it as well. And I think this also gets lost in that meta-analysis. The reason why there may be a smaller effect is that the researchers aren't necessarily trying to show that exercise is better than antidepressants. What they're trying to show is that exercise may be as good as. So it becomes another option. It becomes another treatment alternative for people who may not, for whatever reason, want to use medication, or perhaps they have 16 weeks to wait until they can get a prescribed antidepressant medication as well. But there's always caveats. I think one from this study, and an important one, that the medication group, there was a faster response. So people responded more quickly in terms of the antidepressant effect in the medication group than in comparison to the exerciser group. Though at the end of 16 weeks, and also at the end of 6 months when there was a follow-up done, there was no difference, but certainly the group receiving antidepressant medication improved more quickly. So again, that becomes an issue, that if you're prescribing exercise, that you talk to clients or patients about this. You suggest that, well, one of the kind of drawbacks of exercise may be the response may take a little bit longer. Do you want to wait that long? Okay, no? Okay, well, let's look at antidepressants. So again, it's trying to kind of make this case that exercise is a viable treatment option as well. So consistency is a criteria. Consistency is about, well, do we find these results in different places with different groups, young adults, older adults, in Canada, in the UK, with different times of the year, in different places, different contexts? And yes, the findings are quite consistent from a broad range of evidence that we find positive effects of exercise in the context of depression. So I think we've got at least 4 of the criteria that Hill talked about as being pretty solid. I think that there is certainly kind of evidence that we can draw on to really make a strong case that exercise meets this threshold for temporal sequence, strength of association, experimental evidence, and consistency. But what's missing? There are a couple of these remaining criteria where I think we perhaps haven't got as much evidence as we would like. But I think there's also some good reasons for that. Firstly, there's this notion of dose response, that ideally we want to identify a dose-response relationship between exercise and mental health, or exercise and depression. Do we need to do a certain or a minimum amount to have an effect? If we do too much, does it have a negative effect? What kind of evidence do we have of this type of relationship? Well, not too many people have actually done this yet. So in terms of the types of evidence that perhaps we still need, people tend to have one exercise program, which is the kind of the public health message, at least, though 30 minutes a day of moderate activity most days of the week. Well, work by Andrea Dunn kind of actually looked at that kind of dose, but also included a low-dose treatment group. So there was a group that did the approximate of 17.5 kcal per kilogram per week in terms of energy expenditure, and that equated roughly to the public health message. And then another group who did just under half of that. So in a way, 10 to 15 minutes of moderate activity most days of the week. And then looked at that in terms of, well, what happened in terms of depression? Well, they found potential evidence for a dose-response effect, that it was only the group receiving the public health dose of physical activity that had the significant antidepressant effect, and there was no difference between the control group and the group doing a low dose of physical activity. So here is probably one of the first, well, it is the first, treatment studies that has shown this kind of potential dose-response relationship. But then, there are some problems with that. And again, this kind of more reflects on perhaps my thoughts on the topic, because dose response to me really does imply, or applies to me, primarily a biological relationship or some kind of biological gradient where we're suggesting that the energy expenditure is the critical ingredient for an antidepressant effect. Now, it might be, but I also think that there are other mechanisms that are operating that may be explaining the antidepressant effect. And that the actual response to exercise, at least in terms of mental health, may be dependent upon an interaction of different mechanisms. So a standard dose is unlikely to exist for everyone. I doubt that it's going to be a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. That I can explain how you feel good through exercise is necessarily going to be the same for someone else. But at least we have evidence to suggest that if we're stuck and we want to come up with a message for an antidepressant effect, then the public health message seems to hold true. And this is kind of related to this. I mean, I think presumably there must be a more technical term for this, but it's called a horses for courses or different strokes for different folks. Where I think that there are different mechanisms for different people. And I just thought, it's always useful to kind of also draw on qualitative research, talk to people who go through exercise interventions and talk to them about, well, how do they feel? What did they get out of it? And I think, some of these quotes kind of sum up this point quite well. Here's John, who was a participant in an exercise intervention study, talking about, well, how did exercise make him feel good? It occupies your mind. You're doing something, and I don't know, it just helps me. It gives me a sense of fulfillment as well. If I go out for a good walk, it uses some time up because time hangs heavy on your hands when you're not working at the moment. So there's this notion of, within that statement, there's issues around competence, there's issues around distraction. Two mechanisms he's referring to here in a single sentence. Another participant, exercise sort of enhances the mind-body connection, and I think a part of depression is you're not really in contact with your body. You're all up in your head and the thoughts going round and round. And I got very strong and I enjoyed feeling strong, and I felt more protected feeling strong and fit. And that affected my relations with other people. So here are the notions of the physical self and physical competence, self-esteem, and even social relations, social connectedness. So I think, this notion of different mechanisms is hard to then pin down in a simple kind of dose-response curve. So I don't necessarily know that we can expect it. There's also this notion of coherence. There's some evidence here. This is about the internal consistency of the argument. Does the statement that exercise or sweat is the best antidepressant, I mean, does that kind of ring true? Does that kind of make sense? And some researchers have talked about how, well, men are more active than women, but there's also women have greater levels of depression than men. We know that older adults decline in their levels of activity as they age, but also the prevalence of depression increases. So there is some kind of internal consistency, at least to this relationship between physical activity levels and depression, although there's certainly no definitive evidence about this coherence. There's also this question of for Hill, is there a biological mechanism? And I think, again, this is linked to the case for a dose-response relationship. That, of course, there is plausible biological mechanisms that support an antidepressant effect of exercise, but there is no definitive evidence to suggest that biological pathways are integral. There are studies that show antidepressant effects when there are no changes in fitness, which implies that maybe energy expenditure is not critical. So I don't think we can say with any certainty that there are biological mechanisms at play, but they're certainly plausible. And I'm not going to try to explain this because I don't understand it, but I could talk it through, but I don't really understand it. But this is a great paper in our journal, recent issue of the journal, by Rod Dishman, looking at the role of endorphins in mental health. And I kind of asked Rod Dishman, who's a kind of a leading psychophysiologist, I guess I'd call him. And we always get the media, when I talk to the media or students, they say it's the endorphins in it. That's what's happening when people feel good through through exercise. And Rod Dishman, this article kind of just confirms this with lots of evidence. Says, well, yes, it's plausible, but there's actually no definitive evidence to suggest that there is any link between endorphins and mood responses to exercise. So again, it's plausible, but there is no convincing evidence yet showing that the endorphins are related to mood change or affective change. Certainly evidence showing that endorphins are increased during intense exercise, but then the link between mood and affect is less clear-cut. And again, that's because we are limited to what we can do to investigate this at the moment in terms of the relatively invasive kind of ways in which we'd need to investigate this problem. But I think certainly research in the future may be able to get more at this idea that there is a key biological mechanism at play. But I don't think it's essential, because again, it's endorphins are important after or are affected after intense exercise. But again, we find quite important and powerful mental health benefits for people when they do very modest bouts of exercise as well. And again, I think if we look at more broadly at mental health and what influences mental health, well, it's influenced by a range of different factors. So I think in turn, any change in one of these types of factors could also influence mental health as well. So I kind of very much like a process approach to understanding the impact of physical activity on mental health and on depression, where, again, it's a range of factors related to the type of exercise, the situation you're in, who you are, what your preferences are, that has an impact on potential kind of biochemical mechanisms, psychological mechanisms, and physiological mechanisms. So we don't, the biological plausibility, we don't have any clear kind of evidence there. And one where we don't have any evidence is this notion of specificity. So this is, for example, when we look at lung cancer and smoking, very strong relationship that if you smoke, then that's probably going to be the main main cause of that lung cancer. But we know that depression is caused by a number of factors. It's not just exercise which is critical. We can't necessarily support this one, although this is one criteria that Hill talked about as being not necessarily needed as long as you could develop evidence for the other criteria. So I think we've got at least four of the 8 criteria very strong. 3 of the another 3 we've got bits of evidence that we kind of can pull together, although not exactly kind of a watertight case, and a final criteria which we cannot support. So where does that leave us? There's this question of, well, is the glass half full or half empty? So maybe it's not causal. Well, again, does it matter? Perhaps it is just a placebo. Well, if it helps people, if it works, then does it matter? We don't know why it works. And I think that is, I feel less confident when I sometimes talk to clinicians who say, well, how does it work? And when I talk about that kind of process approach, people don't find that as convincing, because it suggests that, again, it's not necessarily the exercise. Maybe it's the process of exercising. But again, I would go back to some of the debates in other fields, for example, in therapy. No one really knows how therapy works either. that when we look at very different, radically different therapeutic approaches that have similar effects, then this kind of notion of mechanism is very hard to pin down in other treatment approaches as well. And this is what Llewellyn calls this dodo bird, the dodo bird kind of issue, that they don't necessarily think that the mechanisms debate is that important. That again, if it works for people, then that's a start. We can continue on with our work regardless. It might do harm. I can't think of any adverse effects that have been reported in these exercise and depression interventions. It might not work. Again, it's a win-win situation. There are other benefits that can be achieved through physical activity in terms of the physical health benefits. And here's one by again, Blumenthal, actually, in his group, showing that, again, there was, no difference between exercise and medication in reductions in depression. Both were equally effective, but in the exercise group, there was an improvement in sexual functioning, which is, half-hearted, but also it's a side effect, common side effect of antidepressant medication as well. So here is an example where, it's not better than it's not better than medication in terms of an antidepressant effect, but we can have potentially other positive benefits as well. So I think, the physical activity and mental health kind of relationship I'd characterize as being a win-win scenario. We have the evidence for the physical health. Certainly in terms of mental health, evidence is expanding. And I would argue in terms of depression that there's evidence to suggest there's a causal relationship between participating in exercise and reductions in depression. So I think at the population level, we can use that message. I think we can promote physical activity and include potential mental health benefits as another rationale for why people should be active. I think certainly at the service level, we need to start thinking about assessing and potentially promoting physical activity as one option. So it's not going to replace other treatment options, but that here is another evidence-based strategy that clients, patients could consider. I haven't really talked about it today, but there's certainly there may be certain challenges in getting people to be more active in general, but certainly people with mental health problems. But they can be overcome, as this randomized controlled trials demonstrate, that it's not impossible to get people with depression to be active. But I think where we're stuck at the moment, though, is some of the kind of the gap between research and practice, as perhaps mentioned in the introduction this morning. That again, we've got this notion of efficacy versus effectiveness. Efficacy is kind of what works in an ideal situation in this kind of randomized controlled trial context. Yes, exercise seems to have an antidepressant effect, but what about effectiveness? What about the real world? How do we get people in real world situations to exercise? Who does that job? Who tells someone to exercise? How do I, if I'm a psychiatrist and I think exercise sounds like a good idea, who would I refer my patient to? Do I have to get a tracksuit on? Or, how does that kind of work? And I think that's where we're now kind of at in this field, and certainly something where the center could play a role in terms of trying to understand the connections that could be made between mental health professionals and between physical activity professionals. Because there's certainly skill development required on both sides. Exercise or physical activity professionals need to develop mental health awareness, and they need to have that training and exposure to working with clients with mental health problems. Mental health professionals need to feel confident that who they may be referring their clients to are skilled, that they're empathetic, that they can actually work with their clients. And mental health professionals, I think, have a role in legitimizing the role of physical activity, while at the same time, physical activity professionals have a role in terms of making their services accessible, not just physically, but also psychologically as well. So I think I've just come up to 45 minutes, so I will stop there.